Vladimir Putin has moved 55 times farther away from his goal of demilitarizing Ukraine. It's not just a striking number. Ukraine has unexpectedly integrated into the European military-industrial complex, and now its military budget has already exceeded $150 billion a year, while Ukrainian defense factories are now located all across Europe. There is a figure that's very hard to believe. In just over 4 years of war, Ukraine's defense sector has grown 55 times, increasing in value from $1 billion to $55 billion. The number of defense companies has officially increased from 10 to about 1,500. The country that in 2022 mainly knew how to repair Soviet equipment is now building factories in Britain, Denmark, Finland, and Portugal. But the most interesting thing is not even that, but why Ukraine is moving production abroad and why this is a brilliant move. Well, because Russian missiles and drones can reach factories in Kharkiv, Dnipro, Kyiv, and so on, but they won't fly to a factory in Suffolk or Copenhagen, for example. Moscow simply won't risk striking NATO territory. In this episode, we'll break down in detail what the Build with Ukraine program is and how, in a year, it has grown into 47 agreements with 21 countries. Which factories exactly and what they produce, from Shark drones in England to rocket fuel in Denmark. Why Europe is chasing after Ukrainian engineers, where the money for all this comes from and what pitfalls could bring it all down. And most importantly, why this basically means that Ukraine already has one foot in NATO, even without formal membership. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this channel. We are moving towards the mark of 300,000 subscribers, and I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. So, this will not be a typical episode and not a typical format for this YouTube channel. Here we will analyze how Ukraine managed to build a super powerful military-industrial complex with European help and in partnership with Europeans. And why at the NATO summit in Ankara, Ukraine was literally integrated once and for all into Europe's defense sector. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by savage Russians, Ukraine's military industry was not prepared for a prolonged and intense war. The industry largely relied on the production base that remained from the times of the Soviet Union. That is, the enterprises could repair or, at best, modernize old equipment, but they were not capable of mass-producing modern weapon systems. That's why there was this complete dependence on Western military aid. But where we've ended up almost 5 years later, that's the surprising part. Production capacity in terms of value has increased 55 times. Just think about it. At the beginning of the full-scale war, the value of the defense industrial complex, the enterprises, was estimated at $1 billion. Today, it's $55 billion. The number of military technology companies has also increased. At the beginning of the full-scale war, there were 10 of them. Today, there are about 1,500. Our rate of drone production is even higher. Here's the key to why the growth was so explosive. It wasn't just the scale that changed. Well, the scale did change too, but that's not the main thing. The very structure of this industry changed. And we have to say a huge thank you to Denmark for this approach. I'll explain a bit later why the Danes played a very important role here. Instead of a predominantly state sector, a decentralized and dynamic ecosystem was formed. From large corporations to small startups, and most importantly, the work is based on continuous feedback from the front lines. That is, all new solutions are tested and refined right in combat. That's why Ukraine has an advantage in those areas where the speed of adaptation is more important than scale. These are FPV drones, electronic warfare, counter-drone technologies, and so on. The Russian defense industry, remaining centralized, is worse at keeping up with such a pace of change. Although over the past 2 years it has adapted and partially reduced the gap. This is also an important and honest remark. Russia is learning too. But here you might have a question. How did it happen that Ukraine's defense industry grew 55-fold? To understand this, you need to compare two approaches. The turning point happened in 2024. Before that, as you know, Europeans were spending money to purchase weapons for the armed forces of Ukraine. or they gave from their own stockpiles what they already had, and then suddenly, in 2024, Denmark proposed a different scheme. They said, what if instead of supplying Ukraine with finished weapons, Europeans directly invest their money in Ukrainian weapons production inside Ukraine? At first, people were skeptical about this idea, saying that just giving money seemed risky, but the model turned out to be so effective that others adopted it as well. And Denmark was the first to start giving money directly like this, then everyone else started doing it too. That was the foundation. That's how it all began. Already, in 2025, the entire European Union is launching a program called Build with Ukraine. And this was something fundamentally different. If the Danish model is Western money in Ukrainian factories in Ukraine, then the Build with Ukraine model proposed opening joint ventures, assembly lines and research centers already on European territory with Ukraine's participation. Here's an important nuance to avoid confusion. We're not fully moving production to Europe. The model is based on bilateral cooperation and licensing. Here's how it works. According to intergovernmental agreements, part of the products goes to the armed forces of Ukraine, and the rest, what the Ukrainian military doesn't need, is either bought by the partner country we're working with, or this weapon is exported. And the most important thing, part of the production facilities must be in Europe and part in Ukraine. You may wonder why Ukraine needs this, since we're handing our ideas over to Europeans and building a factory in Europe to produce what we've developed. As I see it, there are 4 reasons. And the first one, the most important, is security. Companies can set up production at a site out of reach of Russian missiles and drones, so the logic here is rock solid. Moscow? No matter how it acts, how it blusters, it is unlikely to dare strike production facilities located in NATO countries. So, in fact, Ukraine is moving part of its military-industrial complex under the protection of Article 5 of the NATO Charter without being a member of the alliance. Plus, as a bonus, stable energy supply, which Ukraine itself doesn't have due to strikes on its energy infrastructure. Second, money. The agreements provide access to European Union funding, which Ukraine is critically short of. For reference, in 2026, Ukraine's defense needs are expected to reach a record $158 billion. That's $20 billion more than the previous year. And by the way, that's almost as much as Russia's entire defense budget. Due to a lack of government funds, a significant part of Ukraine's capacity simply sat idle on a regular basis. In other words, there are factories, there are capabilities, but there are no orders. And that's where the Europeans come to the rescue. Money from the European Union's common budget. But Ukraine is not a member of the European Union, so it can't take money directly from the EU's common budget. It just can't. But in collaboration with the Europeans, it actually can. And it does. Third, exports. Right now, exporting weapons produced inside Ukraine is extremely difficult. And often it's almost impossible because of bureaucracy and military restrictions. But factories abroad become a legal sales channel, which means money that can be reinvested into production. And fourth, it's technology and standards. Access to modern manufacturing processes, diversified supply chains, and critically, simplified EU and NATO certification. And importantly, none of this makes the weaponry ineffective. It doesn't make it any less Ukrainian. Okay, Ukraine's benefits are clear, but what does Europe get out of this? This is an fair and mutually beneficial deal. The Europeans get something they can't buy for any amount of money. It's access to technologies that have been tested in real combat, to concepts of their use, and to ultra-fast innovation cycles. The European defense sector is traditionally conservative and slow, while Ukrainians bring speed to it, forged under fire on the front lines. Plus, access to highly qualified Ukrainian engineers and specialists. Simply put, Ukraine is selling combat experience to Europe. Europe pays Ukraine with factories and money. Now let's get more specific, because so far we've been talking in abstract terms about this cooperation. Let's move on to the specifics. The Build with Ukraine program started off slowly, but then it suddenly picked up pace. Really suddenly. By the end of June, 47 agreements had already been signed with the participation of 21 countries from Europe and North America. The leader in all this is Germany. We have 10 agreements with Germany within the framework of this program. More than a fifth of all agreements are with the Germans. The areas in which we work with the Germans are FPV drones and autonomous systems, countering drones, aviation systems, and the production of components for missiles. And today we've just learned that the Germans, as part of this joint program, are financing, for example, the production of 50,000 drones for the armed forces of Ukraine, which are AI-powered. Let's move on. The Czech Republic and Finland. We have signed 4 agreements with each of them, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Spain, 3 each. We have also established joint ventures with France, Norway, Poland, the USA, and Canada. More than 2/3 of the joint projects are related to autonomous systems, loitering munitions, and anti-drone technologies. Europe has clearly realized who is winning the war of the future and immediately embraced Ukrainian know-how. Let me give you some of the most notable projects from the Build with Ukraine program as examples. The German company Quantum System, for example, has launched several joint ventures with Ukrainians. The company Eucaspec Systems has been producing reconnaissance drones Shark and PD-2 in the United Kingdom for quite some time now. In Portugal, Ukraine has long been producing its naval drones, the very ones that later terrorized the Russians in the Black and Azov Seas. Finnish-Ukrainian projects on drones and ground robots have been operating for a long time now. Joint ventures with Romania, Denmark, and the Baltic countries for the development of drones as well. And next, a Polish company, I won't name which one, but a Polish company has already signed a contract and will be producing the Ukrainian 155mm Bodana howitzer. And now a Spanish company, Teknov, will be producing Ukrainian armored vehicles Jura and Kozak. Research and development is in a league of its own. This is where things get most interesting. German company Hensoldt and Ukrainian company Firepoint are working on the Freya missile defense system. I have a separate episode about this on YouTube, so go to my channel and be sure to watch the one where I talk about the new Ukrainian missile. Let's move on. The French company MBDA and the design bureau Luch are working together on the Neptune II anti-ship cruise missile. And here's the most important part. Airbus, together with the startup Skyfall, is working on integrating Ukrainian interceptor drones into command and control systems. Projects are planned for seeker heads, propulsion systems, and other missile technologies. In the future, there will be more joint factories for the production of cruise and ballistic missiles. So-called incubators are also being launched. The Brave Germany program and its counterparts in other countries provide grants to defense startups and organize hackathons, primarily for Ukrainian companies that are ready to enter the European market. And where does the money for all this come from? The funding comes from 2 main sources. These are national programs of partner countries, usually through the Ministry of Defense, and funds from the European Union. Well, in some cases, note that these funds can be supplemented by income from frozen Russian assets. So, in other words, Russia will partially pay for Ukrainian factories in Europe. The specific mechanisms look like this. The European Defense Fund pays for participation in research and development. That's where Airbus and so on are involved. The European Defense Industry Program has allocated 300 million euros for 2026 and 2027 to strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities and integrate its enterprises into European supply chains. And a separate credit mechanism called SAFE, which allows Ukrainian companies to be contractors in European Union projects. They are already operating in Poland, Romania, and Greece. Of course, obviously there can also be problems. This also needs to be discussed. The program has serious obstacles and there are at least 5 of them. The first is export bureaucracy. Strict export controls introduced by Ukraine at the start of the full-scale war limit the potential for international production. Reforms are underway, but very slowly. And here the Ukrainian government needs to work and produce weapons abroad. No matter how it sounds, it's scary. Next comes money, but especially for small companies that want to go abroad, because loan guarantees under the SAFE program depend on the internal policies of partner countries and are still given unevenly. And rather high initial investments can simply kill a project at the start. And next, the third thing is regulations. Ukrainian companies have to simultaneously comply with national, international, and NATO certification standards, cybersecurity requirements, and export legislation. For a small company, it's simply an overwhelming administrative burden to take all of this into account. Here's an example of absurdity. Fortunately, we've escaped it, but it existed to show the scale of these problems. In Denmark, the authorities even had to cancel some national environmental and construction regulations to allow the Ukrainian company Firepoint to build a solid rocket fuel plant. Firepoint also operates in Denmark, in case you didn't know. And finally, protectionism. European defense procurement still gives priority to their own national manufacturers. This could simply stifle Ukrainians even after launching joint projects. And let's be honest, the two most painful issues are probably personnel and corruption. By opening production abroad, Ukrainian companies, of course, risk losing qualified specialists and engineers because wealthier European companies can simply lure them away. And investigations into possible abuses in Ukrainian companies could weaken the political willingness of partners to work with Kyiv. In summary, over the course of more than 4 years, Ukraine has gone from being someone asking for help to a partner with whom Airbus, MBDA and Hensoldt are making missiles and missile defense systems. Already 47 agreements have been signed, 21 countries are involved, Ukrainian factories are located there from Britain to Portugal, and the military sector has grown 55-fold, but the main point is not in the numbers. There's something else going on here. But the main point is in the strategy, as we have figured out. By moving production to the territory of NATO countries, Ukraine is doing 3 things at once. It protects its military-industrial complex from the savage, stinky Russians, receives European money and standards, and most importantly, this is the most important thing, it simply becomes so deeply integrated into the European defense system that separating it from that system will become simply impossible. And then, well, when a country is so integrated into the EU system, the next step is quite logical. Just accept this country into its ranks. Formally, Ukraine is not in NATO. In reality, its engineers are designing missiles together with the French. Ukrainian drones are being assembled in England. Poles will now be making Ukrainian howitzers, and the anti-missile system is being developed together with the Germans. This is exactly what I meant when I said Ukraine is one foot in NATO. Integration is occurring through production, not agreements. Many experts mentioned this at the start of the war. They said, don't expect to be accepted into NATO right away for political reasons. That's not the way to do it. Finland and Sweden are 2 really great examples of how they did it. They integrated so deeply into the defense sector of NATO countries that as soon as the opportunity arose, they were immediately accepted into the North Atlantic Alliance. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.